Just to let you know, Dr. Junkerman is going to be talking about an interesting aspect of the common classic, Last of the Mohicans. I'm excited to find out what he has to reveal about it. So let us welcome Dr. Nicholas Junkerman.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you to the Lake George Historical Association for having me here to talk about this book. I've given a previous version of this talk over at Fort William Henry. In that talk, I focused a little bit more on the military history and on the siege of Fort William Henry. So if you're interested in that material, you can find it pretty easily. They posted it online. But I won't talk a lot about the siege today. I'm going to talk about another aspect of this. I figured since this was the Lake George Historical Association, I would talk a little bit about Lake George in the novel. The setting of Lake George and of its environs down toward Glens Falls and Ballston Spa is an important element of the novel, and especially important part of the first half of the novel. I'll talk a little bit about the ways that the novel is split in half as well. How many of you have read Last of the Mohicans? Yeah. How many of you have seen the 1992 film? There was already some objection to the film. I sort of like the film for what it is in its own way. It is not a faithful reproduction of the movie and of the book, and there are interesting differences that we could talk about if you want. But I do think it's important for the ways that this book continues to live on in our culture and continues to be a book that we know well, at least by reputation or by title, whether or not we've read it, right? Or whether or not it's still being read today. I am a professor of early American literature at Skidmore College, and so I'm always happy to talk about books that fall in my range, and this is one of those few books that people in the general public tend to recognize from early American literature. This is early in the history of the early American novel. American authors born or residing in America start to write novels in the 1780s, but really it's not until the early 19th century that they're hitting their stride like this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how Cooper sees himself as self-consciously building an American literary culture and an American sense of history. When I teach early American literature to my students, or novels in particular, I often look at the title page with them. This is the title page of the first edition. The title pages of early American texts tend to be richer in information than the title pages that we have today, which often just give us the title and the author's name. This actually has quite a lot to say about what's going on in this book, and I want to talk about some of the key elements here. Last of the Mohicans is first published in 1826, down there, too small to read, in a 2-volume edition. It's since been condensed in later editions into just one book, but the 2-volume structure is important. It was Cooper's 6th novel and the second in what would come to be called the Leatherstocking Tales. So there are 5 Leatherstocking Tales. This is the second one, although as I was just saying, it's not actually chronologically the second book in any case. I can tell you about the complexities of that if you want, not particularly important to what we're talking about today. Cooper had enjoyed some literary success before, but Last of the Mohicans is really his first bona fide hit. He sells the copyright for $5,000 to the publisher. It's a considerable amount of money at the time. And he sells out the 5,000 volume run pretty quickly. So this was popular and continued to be popular. As I say, it has a legacy continuing even today. And not just in America, but overseas as well. This enjoys considerable international popularity as well. And I think starts to form people's sense of what this country is about, right? And in that way, it accomplishes his purpose of advertising America's growth and maturity on a national and also an international stage. It's important for us to notice the title of this book. Kind of an obvious thing to say, but I often ask my students to think, well, what else could this have been called? If you know the plot of this book, what else might we have called this? You could have called this Natty Bumppo, or On the Shores of Lake George, or something like that. But he calls it The Last of the Mohicans. This is descriptive. There is a character in this who is the last of the Mohicans, Uncas, who is a young Mohican chief and a brave and noble warrior. But there is also embedded in this last of the Mohicans, an idea about the nature and the fate of Native Americans that is important for us to flag as we move forward here. This is what he has to say about it. Cooper has to say about this topic in the preface to the 1826 book. He says, The Mohicans were the possessors of the country first occupied by the Europeans in this portion of the continent. Here he's talking about southern New England, Connecticut. They were, consequently, the first dispossessed, and the seemingly inevitable fate of all these people who disappear before the advances, or it might be termed the inroads, of civilization, as the verdure of their native forests falls before the nipping frosts, is represented as having already befallen them. There is sufficient historical truth in the picture to justify the use that has been made of it. So just a few things to notice here. He's emphasizing the dispossession of the native peoples, the loss of their land, right? And he seems to feel a little bit of ambivalence about this fact, right? He talks about the advances of civilization, which to me sounds like a positive or at least neutral thing, right? Civilization advancing, that sounds good, right? And then he sort of backs off a little bit and talks about the inroads, right? That civilization is advancing in a way that feels a little bit more negative to me here, at least. This ambivalence about progress or the advance of civilization is characteristic of the novel as a whole, and we'll talk some more about it. But watch what he does here right after that inroads line. There's a simile here. He says, they disappear before the advances as the verdure, the greenery, of their native forests falls before the nipping frosts. This is a natural image, right? You can't do anything about the change of seasons, nor would anyone try to do anything about the change of seasons, right? The leaves fall. Maybe you feel a little bit melancholy about winter coming, but what are you going to do, right? This seasonal calm image, this image of inevitability, along with this little shrug of regret, is a really common feature of literature and rhetoric by white observers in the 1820s. In his 1830 State of the Union address, after the passage of the Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson strikes a similar tone. He says, "To follow to the tomb the last of his race, and to tread on the graves of extinct nations excites melancholy reflections. But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another." You hear that? Another inevitable natural image, right? This is the way things go. Fathers die, sons come along, right? The fact that this is a self-serving narrative is indicated by the fact that they passed something called the Indian Removal Act, which was a law that required Native Americans to leave their ancestral homes, right? You don't have to pass laws in order to make the seasons change or to make father give way to son, right? So this is a sort of philosophical, as Jackson puts it, cover for the dispossession of native peoples, right? An important thing that I'll stay here and then come back to later on, right? And then notice at the end of the quote, he says, there's sufficient historical truth in the picture to justify the use that has been made from it, which is to represent it as having already befallen them. It hasn't happened, right? There is no last of the Mohicans, and Cooper knows it, right? And tells us here that Uncas, the person he presents here to us as the last of his tribe, is in no way the last of the Mohicans. The Mohicans existed before, during, and after the publication of this novel, and exist still today, as the helpful placard out front reminds us, right? So this is a fictionalization of American history, but also of Native history that has important consequences for how people understand the relation between the young nation and its former inhabitants who are being pushed aside for the vast wave of settlement that's coming. Right. This relationship between actual truth and imagination is relevant to another element of this title page here. And here I want to focus on this thing, a narrative, he says. What does he mean when he calls this a narrative? Well, he tells us in his preface that the reader who takes up these volumes in expectation of finding an imaginary and romantic picture of things which never had an existence will probably lay them aside disappointed. The work is exactly what it professes to be in its title page, a narrative. By which he means this is not a novel. This is not fantasy, pure fiction, ghosts, the supernatural, something dangerous, filled with seduction, whatever you, the reader, associate the novel with, right? He is suggesting that that will not be very much to your taste. Here, in writing what we would probably call historical fiction, although he doesn't have that term yet, he's following in the steps of Sir Walter Scott, who you may know. His Waverley novels are published beginning in 1814. They're hugely popular in this period, right? So he's taking up a genre that has proved successful for other people because down on his luck, he needs to make money as well as advertise the historical fame of America. But this is all tied to the creation of what will eventually be called a national literature, right? Something that America in these early days, were some, 50 years after the revolution here, in its early days doesn't have yet. So he's helping to create that. He's not the first American to write fiction about the past, but the way that he insists in the preface on the importance of history is a relatively new thing. Note also 1757, a very precise location in time. This is not once upon a time. This is not many years ago. This is not sometime in the 18th century. This is 1757, right? And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. I will say that I think that the relationship between the imaginary and the historical in this book is more complicated than Cooper lets on here. As, give me your name, sorry. Jan was saying that she finds this book very romantic, and this book is very romantic, right? So when he says that this is not a romance, he's fibbing to us a little bit, or emphasizing one of its aspects to the neglect of another. This is based in history. This is also full of romance, and I think its survival is probably not so much its depiction of the siege at Fort William Henry as it is its canoe chases and its dashing heroes and beautiful depictions of the forests and things like that. He signals, though, this emphasis on romance, or this duality in this novel, with a quote from Shakespeare here. And he quotes Shakespeare throughout. I think he's probably doing this for a number of different reasons. One, it adds to the prestige of the text, right? Suggests a sort of high-tone association, right? Marks this as real literature. But also he's noticing similarities between the plots and the themes and the ideas of Shakespeare and the plots and the ideas and the themes that he's exploring here. So here he takes a quote from The Merchant of Venice. I won't dwell on this, although as an English professor I'm tempted to. But this is the Prince of Morocco, rather, who is one of the suitors of the heroine of Merchant of Venice, whose name is Portia. The Prince of Morocco, in making his suit to Portia, says, "Mislike me not for my complexion, the shadowed livery of the burnished sun." Shadowed livery meaning the dark uniform, right? The burnished sun being both the sort of brassy orb in the sky and the thing that changes his complexion or made his complexion dark, right? So this is in opposition to or anticipating a racist or racializing response and saying, mislike me not for this. We might simplify it to don't judge a book by its cover, right? Although maybe that's precisely what I'm doing right here. This will be picked up in his heroic depiction of Uncas and to a certain extent of Uncas's father, Chingachgook, right? Who are meant not to be misliked for their complexions, but understood as authentic heroes for this novel. Who's the guy who's writing this? I'll run this down quickly because I think it's important for understanding what he's doing here. James Cooper, he adds the Fenimore later in 1826, was born in Burlington, New Jersey in 1789 to William Cooper and Elizabeth Fenimore. We might note this date range. This takes us from just a few years after the Revolution to just a few years before the Civil War, right? And encompasses a time of fantastic change in American history, right? The kind of growth that happens between 1789 and 1851 is almost not to be believed. In the 1790 census, you can go look at these numbers. Places like New York and Boston and Philadelphia are villages, right? Boston is like 20,000 people, right? And by the time he dies, New York will have 500,000 inhabitants, right? Ditto this for what happens in the Midwest, right? The opening of the Erie Canal, but then post that, explosive growth in population. Places like Indiana, they move from having a scattering of white settlers to hundreds of thousands, right? Part of what necessitates, in the eyes of the settlers, things like the Indian Removal Act, right? Cooper's father makes a fortune developing land in upstate New York. He founded Cooperstown on Lake Otsego. Cooper moves to Cooperstown as a baby to what was really then frontier country. And he would have been exposed then in actual life, not only to Native Americans, but also to white frontiersmen of the Natty Bumppo type, right? So there's suggestion in the scholarship that he's writing inspired by people that he actually knew. William, his father, dies in 1809, so James would have been 20 or so. And he left his son a large inheritance, but it was mostly in real estate. That fortune was almost entirely gone within a decade. It's dried up by tangled debt and falling land prices, but also by James's mismanagement. So he is, by the time he's writing The Last of the Mohicans in 1826, in the process of losing his birthright. And I think woven throughout this novel is a sense of loss, of a boy who was born to be a frontier aristocrat and who no longer occupies that standing. People have suggested, in fact, that the Mohican characters in this, both Chingachgook and Uncas, might be representatives of this feeling of loss or dispossession that he feels. Just quickly, we've got the titles of those books down there, remembering again that this is the second one in the series. The Pioneers comes before it, The Prairie comes after. In The Prairie, Hawkeye, Natty Bumppo, who's a character in all of these novels, is an old man. He returns in 1840 and 1841 to this character and to these plots for the Pathfinder and the Deer Slayer. But the one that we're talking about here, this second one, is the only one that's based in this area. I'll take you quickly through the plot, too, before we talk a little bit more about the role of Lake George. The climactic event of the novel, at least one of the climactic events, that comes right in the middle is the siege of Fort William Henry and its aftermath. Again, you can see my other talk if you want to hear more about that. This falls about halfway through the novel at the end of the first volume and the very beginning of the second. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the movements of Volume 1, which is where most of the Lake George material takes place. Right? So, the Monroe girls, Cora and Alice, accompanied by Duncan Hayward, who is a young officer, I'll talk a little bit more about him, and a musician by the name of David Gamet, leave Fort Edward to the south of here, right? And make their way to join their father at Fort William Henry, where he is under siege by the French. Their father, Colonel Monroe, is an officer in the, commanding the British garrison. They are led on this trip by Magua, who is a Huron warrior who is secretly allied with the French and who will become the main antagonist of this book. He's the sort of Satan figure in this text. The group meets up with Natty Bumppo, who I've talked a little bit about before, Chingachgook, and his son Uncas, the last of the Mohicans. When the group discovers Magua's deception, Magua flees, and the group escapes to the caves at Glens Falls. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but there is an early scene of action, a battle fought at the falls between these Huron warriors led by Uncas and the Monroe girls, Hayward, and their band. They're attacked at the falls. Hawkeye and the Mohicans hold them off for a while, but eventually they're obliged to flee, and they leave Hayward, Gamet, and the Monroe sisters to be taken prisoner by Magua. Magua leads his captives south, so they're coming up, and then they turn around and go back down. They lead them south down to the area that we now refer to as Ballston Spa. They find a spring there. There, Chingachgook, Uncas, and Hawkeye catch up with them successfully and free the captives. This completes a first cycle of capture by the evil Magua, and then a freeing by the heroic band of Natty Bumppo and his Mohican friends. Right? Cooper will repeat this in the second volume of the novel too. He is using a formula known here as the Indian captivity narrative, which was a tremendously popular genre in early America. People love to read stories about white settlers being taken captive by native peoples, originally stories from life and later fictionalizations like this one. Once the party's out of danger from the Hurons, Hawkeye leads them back up to Fort William Henry, where they rejoin the Monroe girls' father. The only verifiably historical figures in this text who are major characters are Colonel Monroe for the British and the Marquis de Montcalm, who's leading the French siege of the fort. They represent two sides of the imperial conflict that's roiling America in this moment in 1757. In the novel, Colonel Monroe has two daughters. This is Cora and Alice. Here they are half-sisters from different parents. The actual Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe died at Albany shortly after the battle. We have no evidence that he had got married or had daughters. Natty Bumppo, we've talked about before here. He goes by many names. Sometimes they call him Hawkeye. Sometimes they call him Leather Stocking. Sometimes they call him La Longue Carabine. Is an American, a white American, although he is dear friends with and traveling companions with Chingachgook and Uncas. The bond between these two men is one of the important features of the novel. Major Duncan Hayward is a young man, a sort of dashing hero type, a Southern-born major in the 60th Regiment of Royal Americans. He's brave, he's loyal, but he's not at ease in the woods or in the Indian world the way that Natty Bumppo is. Moving to the right and down here as well, we can see Cooper's essential separation of the native peoples of America into two opposing groups, right? So up here, and I've talked a bunch already about Chingachgook and Uncas, who are the sort of good Indians in this text. They are identified with, connected to the Mohicans, the Lenape people, the Delaware, they're sometimes also called. It's not entirely clear always what particular historical group Cooper is talking about here. He seems to blend elements of the Mohican and the Mohegan, who are separate groups coming from separate places, but he is picking and choosing. He's not doing a completely irresponsible job of this, but he seems not to be focused on getting the distinctions exactly right here. The other group here is vicious, treacherous, savage, and the chief antagonists of the book. He's split the stereotype of native peoples essentially into two, right? The noble savage and the bloodthirsty monster, right? And he packs all the noble savage stuff up here and puts all the bloodthirsty monster stuff down here, right? Hawkeye and his companions also call the Huron antagonists in this book the Mingo, the Megway, the Makwa, which are pejorative Delaware names for Iroquoian peoples. Cooper identifies this group down here, and especially Magua, as their chief in strongly racialized language. He calls them dusky and savage. These are words that he doesn't use for his Mohican heroes. Magua starts out being he's a Huron who's been adopted by the Mohawks. He has a grudge against Monroe. We won't go into all the twists and turns of the plot here, but he starts out as a sort of treacherous character and evolves over the course of the novel, as I suggested earlier, into something like the Prince of Darkness, right? A brooding, sort of Iago-like figure, essential sort of nexus of malice, right? I could go on all day about the plot of this book. I encourage you to follow it up and give it a reread if you feel like it. But I really want to take the bulk of the rest of this talk to think a little bit about what Lake George is doing in this book, or what the locations of the capital region are doing in this book, because I'm going to talk a little bit about Glens Falls too. To set the stage for that, I want us to keep three dates or three date ranges in mind here. So the 1820s, which is when this book is being conceived, researched, written, published. 1757, which is when this book is set in the middle of what would come to be called the 7 Years' War, or in the colonies, the French and Indian War, right? And 2025, today, right? So this book is on the verge of having its 200th anniversary. We are 200 years away from the book itself. We are a good deal more than that away from 1757, but there's also a 70-year gap between this moment too. So we're looking back through at least two layers of history here, which will be important for our thinking about this. Where does this book come from in the 1820s? This book, interestingly, I think, gets its start in aristocratic tourism. In 1824, Cooper serves essentially as a tour guide for a group of 4 young English gentlemen who are visiting America. They're coming on a version of what we call the Grand Tour, where young aristocrats would tour Europe in a sort of gap year, right? Before going back and assuming their responsibilities. They would admire the beauties of the classical world, for example, right? They're starting to do that in America in the 1820s. And in the 1820s, Glens Falls is one of the stops on this tourist itinerary. They're coming up from Albany, they stop at Glens Falls, and then they finish up at Lake George. Cooper joins them probably around Saratoga and journeys up, stopping at Glens Falls, and then proceeding up to the southern end of Lake George, where Fort William Henry was and where he sets a good part of the last of the Mohicans. Indeed, it's at Glens Falls that a man named Edward Smith Stanley, who is the future Prime Minister of England and the most prominent member of this group, remembers Cooper saying, I must place one of my old Indians here. This story sounds kind of made up to me, or at least worked over, you know. But the idea that this place inspired the story is important, right? When Cooper is writing about Glens Falls. When he's writing about Lake George, we have the impression of someone who is thinking of a place that he's been, who's imagining himself not in imaginary terrain, but in a real place, right? This should remind us also, though, that the Glens Falls that we encounter in the novel is an imaginary place, because while Cooper went to that place, he didn't go to that place in 1757, and Glens Falls was already changing significantly by this moment, right? He would have seen something 70 years later, a lot more like what we see here, right? With a bridge and a mill already in place. This is a romanticized version of Glens Falls, but nonetheless, it's beginning to be developed, right? Cooper, I think, as I suggested earlier, has considerable ambivalence about the way that progress is changing the landscape of America. Here's the description that he has Hawkeye give of the falls in the 1757 moment of the novel. Alice Munro asks him if they're standing on an island. Where are we? She says. And he says, aye, there are falls on two sides of us and the river above and below. If you had daylight, it would be worth the trouble to step up on the height of this rock and look at the perversity of the water. It falls by no rule at all. Sometimes it leaps, sometimes it tumbles. There it skips, here it shoots. In one place 'tis white as snow, and in another 'tis green as grass. Hereabouts it pitches into deep hollows that rumble and crush the earth, and thereaways it ripples and sings like a brook, fashioning whirlpools and gullies in the old stone, as if 'twas no harder than trodden clay. The whole design of the river seems disconcerted. First it runs smoothly, as if meaning to go down the descent as things were ordered, and then it angles about and faces the shores, nor are there places wanting where it looks backward, as if unwilling to leave the wilderness and to mingle with the salt. So again, someone who's been here, but also someone who is trying to fascinate us with Glens Falls itself, right? With a location, with a description of a place. But this is only one of the voices of this novel. Cooper also includes a footnote, which forms a sort of contemporary 1820s counterpoint to that 1757 view of the falls. And it reflects the 1820s state of the falls, which would already have looked something like this image, right? This is Cooper talking in what I think of as his full-on tour guide voice here, right? Imagining him taking those four men up to these falls. He says, Glens Falls are on the Hudson, some 40 or 50 miles above the head of tide, or that place where the river becomes navigable for sloops. The description of this picturesque and remarkable little cataract, as given by the scout, he's talking about Hawkeye's description, is sufficiently correct, though the application of the water to uses of civilized life has materially injured its beauties. The rocky island and the two caverns are known to every traveler, since the former sustains the pier of a bridge, which is now thrown across the river immediately above the fall. In explanation of the taste of Hawkeye, it should be remembered that men always prize that most which is least enjoyed. Thus, in a new country, the woods and other objects, which in an old country would be maintained at great cost, are got rid of simply with a view of improving, as it's called, right? So again, here, a dig at what's lost when things progress at the civilizing process. I don't want to mislead you about what this book is about, right? This is not a documentary. It's much more like an action movie. It's packed with battles. It's soaked in blood. There's romance. There's canoe races. There's elaborate disguises. But what's also going on in this book is an effort to recreate a lost world in which nature still dominates, right? And in which the improvements that he criticizes in places like this are not yet in place. That's one of the big things he's doing when he's talking about the landscape, when he's talking about Lake George in this book, when he zooms away from the action to talk about the place. It's similar to what the artist Thomas Cole, the founder of the Hudson River School, is doing in paintings like this one. And it is no accident that Cole makes 4 paintings in the 1820s based on Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, right? So he is thinking hard and engaging in his own way with this project of imagining a national history for the country, right? I'll have more to say about Cole later, and I don't want to go into this in particular detail. It's a little hard to see in this darkened image here, but I think the most important thing that Cooper does is he shrinks the characters in this book down until they're almost nothing, right? If we look back a few slides here, sorry, just quickly, at this N.C. Wyeth image. This is an illustration from the novel. These are the characters. You can name every one. You can see where they're going, what they're doing, right? Sure, there's natural material around here, but sure enough, there's Cora, and there's Alice, and there's David Gamet, and there's Haywood, right? This is helping us to understand the narrative of the book. I do not think that's what Cole's doing here, right? You would need a magnifying glass to figure out what's going down in this little scene here, right? What he's interested in is this setting, right? This unspoiled, perhaps, or only lightly spoiled American wilderness, right? Which he thinks of as one of the glories of this place. So 1757 is an imaginary landscape imbued with this sense of romance, right? But let's not forget 2025, right? This is a little bit of a cheat. I took these in 2023. But this is what Glens Falls looks like now. How many of you have been down to see the falls? Down to Cooper's Cave? Yeah, this is an interesting place, right? It's well signed. They've done a great job of putting interpretive materials there. They tell you how to get there, but you have to park like on a loading dock to get to this spot. And it is tucked away under a bridge with all these pipes coming down with the mill on the other side, right? This is a location in contrast, I think, to Lake George. You might look at the John Apperson stuff over there, the forever wild idea. Lake George has been preserved. Glens Falls has been given over to industry, right? We just decided that that was going to be the way that this went, right? The falls, too useful for preservation as a tourist attraction like they were in the 1820s, have been turned over to this sort of thing, right? So just double layers of imagination here. So imagining Lake George. What's he doing particularly with this place? The final section of the first volume takes us right to the shores of Lake George for the siege of Fort William Henry. It's the major historical event in the novel, and the events of the siege function as a kind of hinge in the middle of the book. The following chapters tell the story of the siege, with Cooper mostly adjusting historical events to allow the central figures of the battle and its fictional characters to play a more important role. Again, I've got another talk where I say a little bit more about that. I can talk about it if you want. But I'm going to turn us consciously back toward this setting here. The scene of the siege opens, again, with a kind of bird's eye view, a description of the scene from Prospect Mountain, right over there. Right? I imagine Cooper writing this book almost as if you could take it with you, at least the first part of it, take it with you as you might a tour guide, right? And stand up on top of that mountain and read his description and then say, oh yeah, I see all that stuff down there, right? Here's the description of the lake. The mountain on which they stood, elevated perhaps 1,000 feet in the air, was a high cone that rose a little in advance of that range, which stretches for miles along the western shore of the lake. You're all familiar with this, right? Until meeting its sisters miles beyond the water, it ran off toward the Canadas in confused and broken masses of rock, thinly sprinkled with evergreens. Immediately at the feet of the party, the southern shore of the Horican, this is a name that he gives to Lake George. He makes this up. This is his application. When you see steamships or housing complexes or things like that named Horican, it's because he wrote this book. That's his lasting legacy in this place. Swept in a broad semicircle from mountain to mountain, making a wide strand that soon rose into an uneven and somewhat elevated plain. To the north stretched the limpid, the clear, and as it appeared from that dizzy height, the narrow sheet of the holy lake, indented with numberless bays, embellished by fantastic headlands, and dotted with countless islands. At the distance of a few leagues, the bed of the water became lost among mountains, or was wrapped in the masses of vapor that came slowly rolling along the bosom before a light mountain air. He's doing Thomas Cole here, right? This is him giving us a Hudson River School description of this place, right? These mists picturesquely laid out across the water, right? This is another version of imagining this place, locating it again in this romantic past in which we're not talking about settlements, we're not talking about war, we're not talking about conflict between colonists and native inhabitants. We're talking about a landscape, right? I'll give you one last example of the sort of double perspective here. There's the blood-soaked past, and then there's this lovely tourist idyll of the present, right, of the 1820s, when rather than being racked by violence, this place is somewhere where you can go and relax and admire a scene, right? Takes a certain amount of stability to imagine a scene like this. Here he goes again. This is an 1831 footnote with another. I mean, he sounds like the tourist board here, right? The beauties of Lake George are well known to every American tourist. In the height of the mountains which surround it and in artificial accessories, it is inferior to the finest of the Swiss and Italian lakes, while in outline and purity of water, it is fully their equal. And in number and dispossessions of its isles and islets, it's much superior to them altogether. The state of New York is remarkable for the number and beauty of its lakes. One of its frontiers lies on the vast sheet of Ontario, while Champlain stretches nearly 100 miles along another. Oneida, Cayuga, Canandaigua, Seneca, and George are all lakes of 30 miles in length, all those of a size smaller or without number. On most of these lakes, there are now beautiful villages, and on many of them, steamboats. Here he sounds a little bit more positive about advancement, about the possibilities of America, right? And about advertising the current state of America. Its beauties, its natural beauties, which presumably have always been there, which we saw in that Thomas Cole-like view, are also a tourist attraction, right? Also something that might drive people to come see this place, that represent a sort of increasing confidence among Americans in their place, right? He's doing something, I think, complicated in this book and ambivalent. I mean, English teachers are always going to tell you that everybody's ambivalent, right? But I really do think he is ambivalent in this book. I think he is moving backwards and imagining forwards at the same time. He's thinking about a past, recreating a heroic past, but in the service of the present and the future, and creating an imaginary version of America that will help to shape how America understands itself, and still does, I think, a little bit today. Right? The idea of Lake George as a place where we go to not just have fun, but to contemplate, to admire beauty, things like that, has some of its roots in this moment and in this novel. Right? I don't overstress that. There's certainly other things going on here, but that's part of what he's doing here. Come, enjoy, relax. We have as good or better as the Swiss and Italian lakes. The second volume of this book, if you have read it or have a chance to return to it, is quite different from the first one. Throughout the entire first part of the book, you can tell pretty much exactly where you are. Remember that tourist guide idea that I talked about? You can locate yourself on a current map of New York. You can find Bloody Pond, you can find Ballston Spa, you can find Glens Falls, all of those things. It's mapped onto a colonial geography. The second volume takes us into the woods in pursuit of Magua, who has once again captured the Monroe girls. But this is a very different world. It's a world of native peoples where the landmarks recognizable to the white characters have completely disappeared. They're basically lost in the second part of this book, save for the sagacity of the Mohicans and of Natty Bumppo, who is a character stuck between a white and a native world. It's also a mysterious place, an almost magical place. Appearances sort of swim and glitter in the second part of the book. A glimpse of a human village in one notable example turns out to be a colony of beavers, right? There are those sort of misperceptions and misapprehensions. Critics have noticed, again, Shakespearean connections to the forest in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is often quoted in the book as well. It's a space, again, of imagination, of fantasy, and of fiction, doing a little bit more of that romantic work that he said he wasn't doing in his preface. Right? Another example, the long-dead Delaware chief Tamenund rises again. This book seems to me never to plant both of its feet in history or in fiction. It's always doing both of those things. Its power, I think, and its lasting effect is probably partly, as I suggested, in its action sequences, but I also think in the way that it cements a kind of national historical imagination. This has a few effects. It preserves and memorializes a traumatic memory and a heroic memory of the siege. Right? It also remembers and creates a national past, a heroic and natural age, to be contrasted with the progressing, modernizing, but also perhaps more artificial and less noble present day. Right? So this allows him to counter the accusation that America has no history. You'll still hear this today from Europeans, right? They'll say, oh, your history is so comparatively brief, right? We have houses older than your, oldest churches, that sort of thing, right? But again, it's a romantic vision. Here's another one of Cole's paintings. A scene from the second volume of the novel where Cora kneels at the feet of Tamenund. Watch him do it again here, right? We could zoom in, if we cared to, very closely on some of these characters, but they are minutely painted, right? The mountains dominate here. They loom over this. They seem almost to efface the narrative. There's a little glimpse of Lake George in the back there. He's pulled a mountain from New Hampshire here, added that in this place. This is a composite portrait of the American wilderness, a product of fantasy as well. But he's advancing that same cultural imagination of an American past, right? He was born in America, but in essence, an American painter, painting a scene based on a scene from a book written by an American author, fulfilling a commission the year after the novel was published. They are cranking up the engine of American culture and building American history at the same time. So again, my point, none too pointed a point here, is that this book is doing a lot of things. It's raising questions about the value, reminding us of the bloody cost of war. It's objecting to the most overt kinds of bigotry, yet it's also creating a nostalgic use of landscape that helps to establish a fantasy version of the nation's past, and again, one that consigns Native people to that past, that freezes them in a kind of farewell, right? That can put them in this landscape almost as if it was putting them in a tomb. And it's not an accident that the book ends with a funeral. It ends with, sorry for the spoilers, most of you have read it, it ends with the death of Uncas and with the death of Cora. Both of them, interestingly, are marked as racial others. Cora is biracial. She has at least African-American blood. And Uncas, who is brave and noble and heroic and very attractive to the Monroe girls, is also in some way intolerable to this book as a final match for them. So the book kills him instead, right? And the book kills Cora, and then the funeral. It's actually a beautiful scene in the book. The funeral imagines them together in a Native version of the afterlife. The Delaware imagine them together in something like what the book calls the happy hunting grounds, right? Wedded at last. The white characters would reject this idea, but they don't know what's going on because they don't speak the language, right? But nonetheless, this thanatopic image is placing, again, the last of the Mohicans firmly in the ground, right? Not part of the future, excluded from the new unum in the E pluribus unum, right? Out of the way with all his complexity and dispossession and grievance and heroism and attractiveness and things like that, right? That's what narratives can do. They can sew things up at the end, right? And make things that are complicated into things that are simple. Beautiful, affecting, romantic, but also simple. Tamenund gets the last word in this book. He's, again, the legendary Delaware chief. You know, Tammany Hall, heard of Tammany Hall? It's named after Tamenund. He becomes one of these sort of Indian mascots, right, of which there are not a few around here as well. He says, "It is enough. Go, children of the Lenape. The anger of the Manitou is not done. Why should Tamenund stay? The pale faces are masters of the earth, and the time of the red men has not yet come again. My day has been too long. In the morning I saw the sons of Unamis, the turtle, happy and strong, and yet before the night has come have I lived to see the last warrior of the wise race of the Mohicans." This is, again, not so, right? It excludes the native peoples from this history and from the present life of the nation with all of the attendant complexities that we're still working out from that today, right? So another way of saying that I think Cooper's Lake George is complicated, right? And not just complicated, but really important to what he's doing in this book. It is a landscape of, as I suppose, you know, look at our picture up here, right? A landscape of fantasy, of memory, of pleasure, of pain, of all of these things at the same time, right? And one of the things that a national literature does is imbue locations like this, important locations, with those kinds of meanings and complicated historical baggage. So you might sense my desire to ramble on. I won't. I'll stop there, but thank you for being here while I think a little bit through Cooper's version of Lake George. That's it.